Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
Andy Alcoholic. Yeah, it's good to be here. Good to be sober. Thanks, Bill. I've sure fooled him over the years. No, man, I thank him and Karen, and you know, they've really helped me out a lot. You know, and Gene too, and Jack as well. You know, and it's been a great ride so far. You know, it really has. And you know, so listening to my mom's story, you know, it's always hard. You know, it's hard to hear about the stuff that I did because I still feel bad about it to this day. You know, especially the stuff that's going on with the family right now. But, you know, it's, thank God for AA. You know, thank God that I have a place to go. You know, I have people to talk to. I have men and women that I look up to and I admire, you know, and I don't have to drink or, you know, get high anymore, because that's what I used to do. And, you know, so as you guys heard, you know, I mean, I was born and raised with alcoholism, you know, and as far back as I can remember, I was just always confused. You know, I didn't know who to believe, you know, because, I mean, it was like every night there was a fight, there was some type of chaos going on. I was scared to death of my dad. You know, I didn't know, one day I'm doing one thing and he's okay with it, and the next day I'm doing the same thing and he's blowing up at me. And, you know, when I say blowing up, I mean like, you know, grabbing a hold of me, cussing me out, you know, all that kind of stuff. And, you know, I was just always really confused. And, you know, when my father would be around, it was like I was always just walking on eggshells. You know, I didn't know what was going to happen. I was always kind of just unsure. And I would always like to go over to my other friends, you know, homes, and I didn't see this going on with their parents, and I'm just wondering, you know, what the hell's going on? You know, what's going on? And, you know, I would hear my parents get into fights and everything, and my sister would go and she would run into her room, and I would go outside at the top of the staircase and I'd listen, you know, because I wanted to see, you know, who's at fault. And, you know, just really just some of the language I would hear him say was just, I mean, it was just insane. It was just insane. And what happened one time was that, you know, in second grade, I remember I raised my hand and the teacher, you know, wanted to see if I had the answer, and I thought I had the answer for something. I don't know, it might have been some math problem. And she said no. And I remember I sat there and I said, "What the F are you talking about? I'm in second grade." And she looks at me and her jaw drops, you know. And then I remember she walks over to my desk. She said, "You're going to the principal's office." And I said, "Don't be a bitch." You know. And I remember, you know, she dragged me. I mean, she grabbed me and she dragged me over to the principal's office, and you know, the secretary's talking to people and everyone's talking amongst themselves, and I go into the principal's office and they say, you know, "Where'd you hear this?" And I said, "Oh, well, you know, I hear from my dad all the time, you know, I mean, what's the big deal?" You know, and then all of a sudden they got really nice. And so I thought, uh-oh, you know, this can't be good. So I changed my story and said, "Oh yeah, I was watching some R-rated movie and, you know, just heard that." And, you know, but you know, that's what it was like. You know, that's what it was like. That's what I was used to, you know. And as time went on, you know, the fights got worse, you know, and I didn't know what was going on, You know, my dad would tell me that my mom was crazy, and my grandmother, you know, before she got Alzheimer's, she had, you know, depression, bipolar. I think it was bipolar, but, you know, so he would always say, you know, she's just like your grandmother. You know, she's crazy and she's acting out, and, you know, this is a real problem. So I thought, oh, maybe mom does have some issues, you know. And I just remember that day when my mom came up to me and she said that she thought my dad was an alcoholic, you know, and she kind of explained to me what it was, because I had no idea, you know. And I think I was in junior high around that time, like 6th, 7th grade, something like that. And I remember when she explained it to me, I thought, well, you know, I mean, it's drinking. I mean, come on, you know, I mean, all you're doing is just drinking wine or beer or whatever. I mean, how hard can it possibly be to stop? Just don't drink anymore. I mean, what the heck? You know, and so I thought, well, you know, clearly he doesn't like you too much. So, you know, I know that he loves me because he's involved in my sports and everything. And so if I ask him, you know, he'll do it. And, you know, so I remember he sat down and I told him, I said, you know, hey, Dad, you know, Mom says you're an alcoholic, you know, and you know, you really need to quit drinking. You know, your dad died of it, and you know, I don't want that happening to you, and you need to quit drinking. And, you know, the look on his face, I just didn't expect. I didn't expect him to do what he did. You know, he just started cussing me out, saying my mom had brainwashed me, and, you know, just started ripping me apart. And I wasn't anticipating that reaction, you know. And from that moment on, I hated him. I absolutely hated him. I wanted nothing to do with him. As far as I'm concerned, you know, he was dead to me. And I was just filled with just this rage. Just this rage. I was just pissed off all the time. All the time, you know. And from that moment on, I always told myself I'm never going to grow up and be like my father. You know, I'm never going to grow up and be like him. I'm better than him, you know, and I'm not going to allow that to happen to me. Well, you should be careful what you judge, you know. And it wasn't too long after that you know, I tried smoking weed and drank a Mickey's 40 under the Avenue A lifeguard tower down in Redondo, and it felt good. You know, I enjoyed it. You know, it wasn't a big deal, and you know, but in the beginning of high school, and I wasn't doing it so much, and I was worried about my reputation. You know, I didn't want people finding out, and you know, because everyone talks, and you know, if one parent knows, everyone finds out, and so I had to keep it quiet. You know, just amongst certain friends, and couldn't do it around everybody, and you know, but by the time my junior year came around, I think that's when, I mean, there was just a real shift, you know, and that's when my whole mentality changed. And I was doing well in baseball, and I was doing well in school. I mean, I was a straight A student, and, you know, taking the AP classes, and, you know, I did well with SATs and all that stuff, and, you know, I got the girlfriend, you know, the high school sweetheart, and, you know, we were in love, and everything was good, you know, and but I needed money to support this habit, so I started, you know, dealing a little weed at school, and you know, and you know, life was good. It was easy. You know, what they told me in Dare about, like, you know, if I started smoking weed, I'd join a gang and wind up dead, didn't happen. So I thought, you know, all that stuff that they told me was just a lie. And, you know, I'd figured this game of life out. You know, the rest of you idiots couldn't get it. But, you know, I'd figured it out. I was good. And, you know, the thing was that I would always tell myself, too, that, okay, I'm just going to do this through high school, and then once I get to college, you know, I'm going to start taking things seriously. You know, that's what we do. You know, once I do this, then I'm going to take it seriously. But right now, I've got a reason for partying and getting drunk and everything like that. And one of the things was that, you know, I never believed that I had a problem at all, or that it had taken over my life, because I was doing well in baseball. You know, I was doing really well. You know, I mean, I'd committed to, I mean, I had my, it was basically I could go to any college I wanted to, you know, and so you know, I signed with SC before my senior year, you know, and then the next thing up was really just about the draft, you know, getting drafted out of high school. You know, I was talking to different agents. I mean, I was just the man, you know, I was the man. You couldn't tell me that anything was wrong. And I remember there were teachers that were saying, you know, I remember them telling my mom one time, or somehow the rumors came around, that I was ditching class and I was getting drunk and then showing up at lunch, you know, and everyone thought I was drunk, that I'd been drinking. And I remember, gosh, I don't know who it was, but someone was asking me about that. I think it was my mom, and she asked me about that, and I said, no. I said, how could I possibly do that and then go to baseball in the afternoon and do what I do? You know, I mean, like, I couldn't do that. And she said, yeah, you know, you're right. I'm just laughing, thinking, like, that's exactly what I'm doing. You know, I just got caught. And, you know, so what happened was that I thought I was going to get drafted out of high school, and halfway through the season I wound up getting mono. And if any of you have ever had that before, boy, that really, it wipes you out. So people thought I was injured, and it hurt my draft stock, and so, okay, I'll go to plan B, I'll go to USC, you know, which isn't a bad plan B. And so I did that, and, you know, the thing was that the reason why I chose SC was because I didn't want to go out of state, because I didn't know where I could get beer or where I could get, you know, weed and everything like that. And I knew that if I stayed local, it was just a quick trip down the 110, and I could go, you know, do whatever I needed to do to get it. You know, and that's the whole reason why I chose that school. You know, it was just all based around that. And I had no idea that my life had become totally consumed around getting drunk, you know, getting messed up, because I didn't like the way that I felt, you know. And so I went to SC, and my whole intention was to start taking things seriously. And I got hurt my freshman year, and now I have another excuse. You know, I have another excuse to, you know, go get wasted every single day. And I did that, you know, and all this time to support this habit, you know, I kept, you know, dealing drugs. That's what I was doing. And that grew. The drinking grew. You know, I went from smoking weed to doing, you know, ecstasy, cocaine, acid, mushrooms. I mean, popping pills. I did everything. But I always told myself I was never going to shoot drugs, because only addicts did that, you know. And clearly, I wasn't an addict as long as I didn't put a needle in my arm. You know, so, you know, as time went on, you know, things got a lot worse, you know. It's kind of like that part in the book that talks about how, you know, an alcoholic will change their standards to meet their behavior, but a normal person will change their behavior to meet their standards, you know. And the whole idea being that as my behavior gets worse, my standards become lower and lower and lower, you know. And that's how it became okay to start dealing drugs. You know, it became okay to go from getting A's and B's to B's to C's to D's to D's to F's, you know, to finally, you know, I was just happy with an F as long as I wasn't withdrawn from the class. And that's what happened to me. You know, the girlfriend finally decided that she had had enough. You know, she left, and I never thought that she would. And, you You know, I was struggling with baseball. I was getting in trouble a lot with the coaches. I was kicked off the team, and they let me back on. And I remember one time, it was my sophomore year, my coach told me, he said, you know, Andy, your biggest problem has nothing to do with what you do on this field or what you're doing in the weight room or anything like that. It has nothing to do with that. You know, your biggest thing is, what do you do when you leave the field? You know, what do you do when nobody's looking? And I thought to myself, oh, this guy's an idiot, you know. You know, you're just not giving me a chance, and, you know, I was pitching, and, you know, you guys, I mean, you guys don't call the right pitches, and you guys are too fastball happy, and I should be throwing more curveballs or sliders, you know, and just making up excuses. And, you know, I was living with my roommate at the time, who was the quarterback, and, you know, I mean, you know, he wasn't an alcoholic. You know, he did his thing, and, you know, eventually he started to worry about me. You know, he would take the car keys, he would take the bongs and hide them, you know. He would, you know, he would pour out the Grey Goose that was on the counter, and it used to really piss me off, man. It used to really piss me off. And, God, I just wanted to kick his ass. And I thought, but if I did, it's going to be all over SportsCenter, you know. But, you know, I lived with this guy for 4 years, you know, and I remember, you know, I always thought he wasn't really the sharpest tool in the shed, you know, but, you know, one day after the girlfriend left and, you know, I was getting kicked off the team, and they just let me back on just barely, and I was on academic probation, you know, I mean, I was just barely struggling to keep a 2.0, barely. And he's sitting there one day, and he has a dip in his mouth watching Seinfeld, and I'm sitting there, and I've got the bong here, cocaine out, you know, and I'm drinking too, I mean, just getting wasted. And he proceeds to tell me, he says, you know, Andy, don't you think that all this stuff that's going on with your life has something to do with this? And he said, just be honest with yourself, man. Just be honest with yourself. And as soon as he said that, like, it just hit me, you know. It hit me like a ton of bricks. And I just thought to myself, gosh, you know, this guy isn't the sharpest tool in the shed, but he's got a point, you know. And what happened from that moment on was it ruined my drinking. It ruined it. You know, I couldn't have fun anymore. And I would try as hard as I could. I mean, I was doing the whole Hollywood thing, and on weekends I would go to the Roosevelt Hotel, and I'd be there all weekend, and I tried as hard as I could to have fun, but I was miserable. I was miserable. I wanted it to look good. I mean, it sure looked like I was out having fun, but I mean, I was dying. I was dying, man. You know, and one thing is that I couldn't show up to class. You know, I couldn't show up at all. You know, and like I say, I might be the only person in the history of that school that failed ballroom dancing back-to-back semesters. You know, and the thing was that, you know, I mean, it was a 7 p.m. class, a 7 o'clock at night, and by 7 p.m., I mean, I'm like blackout by then. You know, there's no way I'm going to a 7 p.m. class. And the funny thing was, as I was thinking about that ballroom dancing class the other day, and I remember too, what happened was the second time, I remember, because it was a issue about whether or not I'd be eligible, and I had to pass. And I remember I went up to the professor, and, you know, I told the professor of that class, I said, hey man, you know, I haven't been making it to class because things are real tough, you know, like my mom has cancer and she's dying, you know. And he sat there and he crossed his arms like that, and he said, you know, you told me that last semester. And I thought, oh, okay. I said, see ya. I just left, you know. And to this day, I swear I did not tell him that the semester before, but I honestly don't remember, you know. But I know I'd used that line on a few other teachers before, but it never really helped, you know. And so, yeah, you know, I mean, Christmas Eve of 2007, you know, I got a DUI in my roommate's car, and, you know, I was going 85 on PCH at 2:45, and when they pulled me over, I was triple the limit. And, you know, to be honest with you, I didn't even really feel that wasted. I thought I was fine. You know, I mean, that's just really where my tolerance was at. And, you know, but I remember, you know, I went to jail, and when I got out, I was scared that my parents were going to find out. You know, and when you get a DUI, I don't even know if they still do it, but you get all those DUI like advertisements that come to your house from, you know, when they give you your license. So I'd always try to shoot home every day to grab the mail and just weed out all that stuff, you know. And one day I just didn't make it in time. And so they sat me down, and you know, they asked if I had a DUI, and so I told them, like, yeah, I did. You know, and I remember my dad sitting there. Now, keep in mind, you know, I mean, I hated my father, you know. But all that stuff about his drinking, I was just non-existent because I'm only thinking about myself. And so he says, well, don't worry, Andy. He says, DUIs are just exaggerated traffic violations. And I said, oh, Dad, my new best friend. You know? Buddy, you know. And, you know, and I remember just thinking, like, gosh, you know, my dad's the coolest guy. You know, now I love him. And, you know, like those 4 or 5 months went on, and, you know, that whole time I was trying to stop. You know, it was that thing about every imaginable remedy. You know, we tried everything. So, you know, I quit doing cocaine. I quit drug dealing. You know, I would only, you know, I would only drink vodka. You know, because it was the Jack Daniels that was really causing the problems. And, you know, I mean, I tried everything. I tried everything, and nothing worked. Nothing worked. And I remember that last DUI, when I got that last one, you know, the police had pulled me over, and there was 3 other people in the car, and I remember sitting there, and just for some reason it just hit me like, oh my God, you're not just like your dad, you're worse than your dad ever was. Worse than he ever was. I remember sitting there thinking, like, I have to do something about this. I can't let this go on, you know. And when that happened, you know, it was just like this giant relief. You know, this giant weight was just taken off my shoulders. And, you know, I remember I went to jail, and when I got out, just like my mom said, I went home and, you know, went and asked Mom for help. You know, and they were there. You know, and when I told them that I had a problem, you know, and I needed to get help and I was trying to stop, you know, my mom, you know, was kind enough to help me out, but I remember my dad just saying, oh shit, and he got up and just left, you know. And what happened after that was that it took me a while to get into a rehab because, I mean, I was just out of my mind. I was out of my mind. I remember I did this interview with someone at Betty Ford, and it was like for 45 minutes or something, and the woman just said, well, some people need to go to jail, and just hung up the phone. And I was thinking, oh man, you know, that's stupid, you know. And so I had a hard time getting in the rehab, and I remember people talked about going to AA, you know, and so I was just desperate, you know. I was just desperate for anything because I could not end up like my father. You know, this has to stop. You know, so someone told me about the Monday night meeting, you know, and I might have had like a day, maybe, you know, and I remember I went to the Monday night meeting by myself. And I remember, you know, my home group is the Monday Night Men's Stag. And, you know, when I started listening to all those guys and hearing about what they're talking about, man, I mean, it's like they were talking to me, you know. And they seemed to be laughing. They seemed to be having a good time, you know. And that's kind of the thing is that, you know, before I got sober, you know, I was so miserable, just so miserable. And I remember, you know, always thinking to myself, this can't be what life is about. You know, this cannot be what life's about. Look what I have here. You know, I mean, look where I am. I mean, the opportunities that I have. And I mean, I just, you know, every morning I would wake up before I got sober. I didn't even want to get up. You know, I was hoping I would never wake up. You know, I mean, I was drinking for the blackout. I blacked out every night that last year. You know, and I just never wanted to get up. I didn't want to. You know, and so when I came to my home group, you know, the men's stag meeting, I'm listening to all these guys. I knew that they had something. I couldn't tell you what it was, but I wanted what they had because they seemed to be enjoying themselves. And it seemed like the whole meeting was about me, you know. And I listened to them, and they talked about getting a sponsor. They talked about having a sobriety date, you know. So I got one. My sobriety date is May 13th, 2007. And, you know, I've been sober ever since, you know. And so I went to rehab. I did that whole thing, and when I came back, I, you know, like Bill said, I saw his son, and, you know, he told me that stuff, and he actually told me he was the president of the Alano Club. And, you know, but one of the things he told me was that I really wanted to stay sober, you know, and he looked at me dead in my eyes, and with a serious face, he said, the guys my dad sponsors, they get sober and they stay sober. And I remember thinking to him, well, this guy must know some stuff then, you know, I'm going to get him, you know, and I did. And I remember I was so scared when I first showed up to my first AA meeting, you know, like all newcomers are, and you know, I couldn't identify myself as a newcomer. So for those of you that do, you know, when you go to your meetings, I mean, congratulations, man. I mean, you got more courage than I certainly had. And you know, and even my sponsor was that I went to a meeting and I saw him, but I was too scared to go over and say anything to him. You know, I mean, I wasn't even really aware of just really how scared to death I was of everybody. You know, and so I ended up calling him. You know, and he said, yeah, and, you know, he told me what to do, and so we got together and we started reading the book. We started doing the deal, you know, and he took me through the steps. You know, we did the inventory. I made the amends. I made the amends to my parents, my family, you know, all that stuff. And I started working with other guys, and one thing that he did too was I was always looking to go to more meetings, and I went to the 11-step meeting, and you know, when they started talking about this meditation thing, it was just something that just kind of set me off. You know, it was something that just lit me up. And, you know, I just started really just diving into this whole spiritual thing. I talked to my grand sponsor, Jay, and he would always tell me, you know, you always have to have 2 books, you know, the big book and some other piece of spiritual literature. So I would just, you know, try them all out. You know, it's like what Jay says, you know. You gotta, it's like you're drinking. You gotta test them all before you pick your favorite. So I did. You know, that's what I did. Man, I did the classes. I went to workshops. I'd go online. I'd get the CDs. I mean, thousands of hours. And I would, you know, I'd spend time meditating, and it was, you know, it was just crazy what happened. You know, I mean, what happened and what's been happening in my life is unbelievable. Unbelievable. You know, I got the chance to go back to school. You know, believe it or not, they let me back in. You know, because I was actually kicked out of school. And, you know, well, first what happened was I tried to go back into baseball, you know, because I'm a baseball player, obviously. And I remember just one day, you know, and everyone's always talking about it, everyone's always asking me about it. And I remember one day just sitting out there, I was in Arizona, and I remember I was in the outfield, and I was thinking to myself, like, I'm really not having any fun. You know, like this really just ain't fun anymore. And I was reading this stuff, and discovered that I liked reading, I liked learning, and I thought to myself, you know, I want to go back to school, I want to get an education, and, you know, get my degree, because I'm only like, you know, a semester away. And so I walked away from baseball, and people were just like, oh my God, like, you know, I mean, are you crazy, this and that? And I thought, yeah, probably, you know, but I really don't care, it's just what I kind of feel like doing. And I went and did it, and I loved it. You know, and I had a hard time getting back in, but they wound up letting me get in. And, you know, I went from getting a 1.8 and failing ballroom dancing twice, you know, to now all of a sudden I'm taking, you know, I've finished a double major in sociology from the previous time to psychology, and, you know, and getting A's in classes like cognitive neuroscience and all the stuff like that. You know, I mean, I went from getting D's and or F's and D's to C, to when I first came back, I got C's and B's to A's and B's to straight A's to then, I mean, the last 2 semesters, it's been like I didn't want to take a test and get a single problem wrong. You know, I didn't want to get one wrong. And that's just what happened, you know, and I found myself, you know, hanging out with professors. You know, I mean, I would have lunch with professors. I would go to their office hours, and sometimes I'd be there 4, 5, 6 hours. You know, and I'd loved it. I loved every minute of it. And that was not me before I came here. It wasn't me at all. You know, I was a guy that couldn't even show up, you know. And, you know, one of the things about showing up was that when I first got sober, my grandmother was passing away from Alzheimer's, you know. And if any of you have ever been a caretaker for someone who has Alzheimer's, you know it's a tough thing. It's a tough, tough deal. And, you know, watching my mom handle that, and, you know, and when my grandmother did finally pass away, I just always felt like I'd missed something, you know. And so I always told myself from that moment on, I'm not going to be absent from things like that, you know. So when my grandfather got sick, you know, even well before then, you know, I mean, I was living with him, and, you know, we were buds. We were buds, man. And one of the things that I'll never forget was when I went to my grandfather and I told him that I had this problem. I was very worried about what he might think, because he's an old school guy, and at the time he was in his late 80s. And when I told him that I was an alcoholic, he just smiled and kind of laughed, and he said, "Well, don't worry, man, we still love you," you know. And at that moment, you know, it just cut through. It just cut through everything, and it just hit me, just like I can't let this man down. I couldn't, you know. And so I took care of him. You know, I took care of him all the way until he took his very last breath. I was there. You know, and that's definitely one of the gifts of this program. You know, and one of the other things that, you know, I'll touch on before I wrap it up here is, you know, this program has really helped me deal with my dad. And the way things are right now, it's been hard, very hard. But, you know, a lot of times when I'm talking to guys about what's going on with everything, it sounds like it's very hateful, you know, but I know after doing this stuff that all that hate is really just because I'm hurt. I'm tremendously hurt, you know, and it's like that little kid that was asking his dad to get sober. And it's hard. It's hard to sit and watch a family member, you know, drink themselves to death. It's hard to watch the collateral damage it does to other family members. But I have to remember, you know, I mean, he's just like me. You know, at the end of the day, he's an alcoholic just like me too. You know, and I have to take an honest look about my part in things, because I do have a part. And one of them is that I really haven't forgave him. You know, and I need to forgive him. And I need to accept him for who he is. And I need to forgive him for myself. You know, because our book talks about resentment being the #1 offender. You know, not alcohol, resentment. And I don't have the luxury of being able to sit on that. And the ones that'll hurt you more than anything, my experiences, are the justified ones. And if anyone's got a justified one, man, I mean, I sure have one right now. And so I have to be in constant contact with guys in AA and make sure that I'm doing this thing. And continue to pray, meditate every day, you know, multiple times a day. Whenever I can, just stop and take a break, you know. And so far I've been able to get through it as best I can, but it's tough. You know, some days are better than others. And this whole forgiveness thing, I mean, I don't really know how it happens, you know, but all I know is that, you know, my experience with dealing with these spiritual principles and these tools that we get since I came here is that if I do this program, you know, what disturbs me just seems to kind of disappear if I'm doing it. You know, I don't know how it happens, but it just does. You know, and it's kind of like the good things that happen in my life. They just kind of suddenly appear. You know, and so I have to make sure that I keep doing this thing. And, you know, there's going to be a light at the end of the tunnel, because when I look back at my whole journey with where I'm at right now, you know, I mean, I can look back and honestly say that all the bad things in my life ended up being the very best thing that ever happened to me. The very best thing. You know, getting kicked off the team and the girlfriend left, you know, everything like that was the very best thing that ever happened to me. You know, because it helped me get to AA. You know, and this program is the best thing that's ever happened in my life. You know, and like my professor, it was like, I don't know, a year ago, you know, I became a research assistant in this PhD graduate program, you know. And she's looking at my transcript and stuff, and she's just saying, she's kind of laughed. She's saying, "Oh my God, it's like two different people. You know, it's two different people." And she says, "What were you doing?" And then before I said anything, she said, "Well, I know what you weren't doing." You know, and, you know, yeah, so I mean, it's crazy. I mean, I got a full-time job now. I got, you know, like I said, I'm this research assistant, and actually the place where I'm researching at, which is, you know, I study mental illness and co-occurring disorders with substance use, and you know, I have my own office on the 8th floor over at SC, and it overlooks the baseball field. You know, you can kind of see like how far I've come. You know, I got a job where I'm working with people down on Skid Row. You know, I mean, there's times where, you know, I mean, I'm pulling 14-hour days. I've got another project with other investors and stuff, and I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy, you know, from what I'm doing now with what I used to be like, and it's all credit to this program. You know, it's all credit to my sponsor and his wife, and grand sponsor Jay and Gene, of course, and, you know, Jack sure helped me out a lot too, and, you know, it's just a beautiful thing, man. So, you know, thank you guys for, you know, having me and my mom be here, and thank you very much.
Sorry to interrupt your viewing. Taper Dave here. Just wanted to take a second to ask you to like and subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you like what you're listening. I've got some very good talks here, and this one's a great one. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Tell me what you think. Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst, then one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. I don't know if that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right, but I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.